That's me. That's a good picture of me. This is me in real life, which is key to this talk, actually. I do a bunch of stuff, but right now I work at marketing at a startup, but I've been at startups and not startups and done all kinds of things. So this is the key thing I want you to take away from this talk. So I put it at the beginning and I'll put it at the end, because as Richard said this morning, you might as well get to the point. So it's basically 4 operating principles for daily work or even daily life. First is that you should always be refactoring. Always be refactoring everything, especially your own thinking. Second is that diversity has intrinsic value. These two things are very closely related. Third is that the territory is more important than the map. Because the territory is constantly changing, you have to always be refactoring. And diversity is the only way you ever figure out that the territory has changed. And finally, you should actively seek invalidation. So this is effectively the scientific method, right? Except it should be applied to everything. You should actively be seeking the fact that you're wrong about something, or that your view of something doesn't hold, or that the way a thing is supposed to be is not that way. It's better that you find it before it finds you, because guaranteed it will find you and it's going to hurt. And if you find it first, it might hurt a little less. So we'll start with theory and then go on to practice. How many people are familiar with this notion? If you were in my talk last year, we're just going to say the same thing again. That stands for observe, orient, decide, and act, which is this idea from a gentleman named Colonel John Boyd from the US Air Force. Essentially what it comes down to is you observe what's going on, you orient yourselves towards it, you make some kind of decision, then you act, which creates new observations, and so on and so forth. There are a handful of points I'd like to make. First is that if I'm oriented this way, I am not going to observe you. And what I'm observing now will not tell me to orient to you. So these things are intrinsically related. What you do changes what you can see, changes your view of things, changes what you do, changes what you can see, etc. Oh, I don't know what happened. Wait, I fixed it. Sweet. Okay, so there's this idea that you're supposed to go ever faster, and I'd like to talk just briefly through the mechanics of why you go faster. So if I run through the process of figuring out what's going out there in the world and how it relates to me, and then making some kind of decision and acting on it faster than you do, then I'll have acted on something before you have, which means the thing you're trying to do may not work anymore. So someone tries to punch Muhammad Ali. Muhammad Ali's head is already over here. Their punch is going over there. They have not hit him, which means they got to start over. There's a next step, which is that I might go through the whole process of figuring out what to do and doing it before you even decide on what to do, which means I frustrated your ability to even get to an action, so you just start over. So I short-circuit the process. The next step beyond that is I can go through this entire process before you have figured out what the world looks like. If I do that, then I've effectively prevented you from orienting. I'm disorienting you. You are now disoriented. And I can do that over and over and over again until you just basically systems explode. You get little beach balls. And this happens in people's brains. This happens in competitive situations. This happens in fencing, if you ever watch fencing, where things happen very quickly. Yes, moving on. How do we get from one bit to the next? We use models. Everybody knows what a model is, a model of a thing, right? Yeah, it's an abstraction. We love abstractions in computer science and in operations and in programming and building things. Now, models have observations. They embed observations. So you're going to build a thing in a particular way because you've observed a pattern out there in the world that you want to react to. They also have a specific context, right? So I have like an actor model. That actor model has the context that you have multiple actors and they all take actions and each is aware of the other actions and then reacts. Now, models are primarily the way we orient into the world. And a good example of a model is a Google Maps. Google Maps tells you that there's a point A, there's a point B, and you get from point A to point B down these roads, and there are all these obstacles, except as people have probably read, Google Maps can take you directly into the ocean and make you think it's a path. right? So they're providing you with a means of saying, I am here, everything else is there, here where other people are, or whatever, and this is how I might navigate my way through the world, but they're inherently unreliable. I love maps. Maps are hyper useful. I think maps are generally a more concrete way of understanding models. I'm also kind of a map head, and this is a variety of map. So this is the most useful map I've ever seen for figuring out how to build a product or what to do in a business when you're trying to build a business or compete with other businesses. It's called a Wordley map. Simon would call it a value chain map. If you've never heard of it or seen it, I would suggest looking up Simon Wardley's OSCON keynotes, where he kind of runs through how these things work. They're very interesting. Simon is a researcher at the Leading Edge Forum, which is an outfit out of CSC that looks into how businesses operate in different marketplaces and how they compete with each other. Now, a map basically starts with, or a Wordley map basically starts with some kind of need. A user has a need, and that need is serviced by some set of activities or products. Now, from there, you go deep. So any given product has a set of components that live below it, that make up its own supply chain, right? And you have needs, and these needs are serviced by different components, and you keep going further down the chain. So this is your y-axis. This is where it actually gets interesting. I have to put this thing down because this will take a minute. So on the x-axis, what he puts is stages of evolution. So on the left-hand side, you have Genesis, which is basically you're doing something novel. You're doing something no one has ever done before. It's a process of discovery. There are no patterns. There are no conceptions. You're basically flailing about, trying to get to a point of having some understanding of how to solve a problem. On the far right, you have a thing for which there's an absolute definite pattern in the world, right? Thing like power supply, right? Power supply is a utility. It's a utility because it's effectively a commodity. There are multiple suppliers for it. Everyone knows how to do it. There are very low margins. It's just distribution and scale. In the middle, there are a handful of steps. There is product, which is basically commercial off-the-shelf products, right? Something is done enough, frequently enough, that there are well-known patterns. There are multiple suppliers of it, and you can just buy it and use it. Then the less known part is custom built. This is effectively where you either take a known product or frequently what we do in our world is take open source technologies and customize the heck out of them in order to produce a useful component of your own. Everything eventually goes from left to right. If you can build something that kind of like gets stuck around custom built, then you've built something that's highly specialized, highly niche, and is unlikely to scale to be a large market or a large business. But most things go over time from left to right. Now, the stages of evolution actually encode a lot more information. I am not going to go through this. I leave this as an exercise to the listener or the reader. You can get the slides later and look through it if you want. But all of these things, actually, I found in my experience to hold. And my experience is not minimal. I mean, I'm not like 80, but I've been in and out of this space for 20 years now. So you can take a given component and explode it and say, here within that component, in this case content, there's a pipeline or a supply chain. So we commission something and eventually we acquire it. You can add consumption and production. Am I providing a service or am I consuming it? What are the things that I consume? What are the things that I provide? You can add what your methodology is. Am I building this using an agile method? Am I building this using Six Sigma? Am I using an off-the-shelf product or what have you? How do all these things relate? At this point, what you've done is basically mapped out your entire business from a product perspective. Not from a go-to-market or making money perspective, but from a product perspective. Once you have that, you're effectively looking at something that's more like a chessboard, right? You can, this thing has a laser pointer. Hang on. Oh, that's fun. All right, so you can be like, I'm going to take this bit right here, and I'm going to open source it. By open sourcing it, I hope to turn it into a variety of commodity so that I can build an ecosystem around it, and that ecosystem turns into a kind of moat, and then eventually I can cannibalize bits of that ecosystem and build an ever bigger moat. This is what Amazon does, and they're very good at it. Or you can say, this thing right here, this is uncommoditizable. No one's going to be able to do this, so maybe this is something I should try to do. Which leads me to being fragile. So, like we said before, the world is constantly changing, which means you must change with it. If the world is constantly changing, your maps are eventually out of date, your way of looking at things are eventually out of date, and you're eventually going to drive into the ocean. Black swans are those things which don't fit your maps. They're unmodeled. There are things you can't see because they're out of left field, because they don't fit your view of the world or your view of the marketplace. And eventually, a black swan will find you, because all maps, are best approximations and not reality. So being fragile or anti-fragile is contextual, right? If this is my model of the world, and it says that the ocean is to the left, the mountains are to the right, straight is north, behind me is south, then I am anti-fragile to the ocean rising, because I know it's going to rise that way, and I can go that way, and I'll be safe. But if the world changes, and all of a sudden the ocean is to my right, and the mountains are to my left, then I am now fragile to the ocean rising, because I still think the mountains are over there, and I'll run right into it. So although, has everybody heard the term anti-fragile before? Yes? No? Yeah, so it's basically this idea that you, in a given situation, under a certain amount of stress, instead of buckling under that stress, are actually improved by it or grow by it. But that only works in a certain envelope, in a certain context. Here's my tangent. This is the fun part. This is what everyone thinks highways look like. This is what highways actually look like. The only difference is time. This is how we deal with it. This is refactoring, paying down technical debt, or what I just like to call maintenance. It's just maintenance. If we don't do it, this is what happens. Everyone seen a sinkhole before? All right. So here's what we think the APIs we use look like. Here's what we think the services we use look like. This is also what those API providers think their APIs below them and the services below them look like, all the way down. And for some of us, all the way down could be a dozen providers deep. This is actually what they look like. And this is what everyone should be doing all the time. Finding those little holes and filling them up. That's not what happens. So instead, what happens if you build things on AWS or GCE or Azure, you've had experiences like this, or you use APIs from anyone, from Twilio, for example. You've had these experiences where at some point in time, all of the little gaps in all of the providers line up such that one insignificant event can turn into a systemic failure, and you have catastrophe. This is true of systems. It's true of software. It's true of societies. It's true of bureaucracies. It's true of everything. Okay, back from my tangent. So let's talk about practice. In this case, I'm going to talk about my own practice. So let's map my work. So here's the beginnings of a map for a very specific feature that, before I go into this, I do not speak for my company or the founders or the leadership, et cetera, et cetera. And this is just me. So this is for a feature that we just released that's in beta. And the way I characterize it is what we're trying to do is help people, specifically people with operational responsibilities, discover known unknowns and unknown unknowns. And in order to do that, we have to provide a particular kind of visualization, which depends on a bunch of other things, and you end up building out a large map. Now, one of our engineers is going to talk about this and why this is important in the process tomorrow morning in a keynote. So I'm going to kind of show a couple of his slides here. Pretend I didn't do that. Don't let him know. And I know he's not in here. He'll be very cranky if he finds out. So basically, the idea is that you've got a bunch of information coming from all over the place, and what you really want to get to is things you don't know. So based on streaming live operational data, we're going to point out, oh, here are some things that go together that are correlated, and they're correlated to this thing over here, and that thing over there is that set of machines up there that perform this function or service or cluster or whatever. And this is not something that is otherwise knowable. So I don't want to spend too much time on that. Anyway, so this is the whole map for it. So this is starting with the user need on the top left to the fundamental suppliers at the bottom of the supply chain on the bottom right. There are some things that are noteworthy about this. First is that we rely on commodity or utility providers for basic infrastructure and services. In this case, we run on AWS, like many people. But we also rely on a set of open source standardized technologies on which we build stuff. Now, I'm leaving a lot of bits out because, business. The next thing that's interesting to note is that inputs into our system from the outside are standard, relatively standard, in that they're open, public, they tend to be open source, people know about them. We don't impose that standard on the world, we accept that standard from the world. Next is that there is a linchpin. There is something without which everything else falls apart and is disconnected. In our case, that linchpin is a streaming analytics engine and platform. That's also where all of our IP is. If you look at any business, you will find linchpins like this. This tends to be where IP is. This tends to be the thing that ends up being trademarked and defended, et cetera, et cetera. And strategically, things that one can open source and disrupt markets with. By the way, there's if you're interested in competitive intelligence, through the things like trademarks, copyrights, marketing, speak, and behaviors of players in a given marketplace, you can reverse engineer where their actual linchpins are and basically build maps out of them. And then finally, you'll note that we have a lot of custom components, but all of those custom components are things built out of open source technologies, this is very common for a SaaS product. Everything from like HubSpot in marketing down to us in monitoring to things like Shippable. There we go. So actually, there's one more thing I think worth saying here, which is that each of these, in order to build what we wanted to build, we ended up building a lot of other things, each of which on its own is actually a bunch of companies out there in the world. And this is also something that's common. So if you took these specialized components that we built and generalized them, you would end up with Elasticsearch, Cassandra, et cetera, et cetera. And in fact, that's kind of the reverse of what's actually happened. Since those things already existed and they were relatively well-known and understood and standard out there in the world, we highly customized them to get to our specialized time series database built on Cassandra, our specialized metadata store on Elasticsearch, our specialized real-time message queue on Kafka, et cetera, et cetera. All right. So given all of that, I have basically two kinds of important questions. First, I have a limited amount of time in any given day. I'm trying to solve the user need on the top left. What is the thing I can do today to move the needle on that, to actually make that realize and make it true? The second question is, how am I wrong? So, am I right about the user need? Are people, if I explain that to people, do they respond with, nodding heads and yeah, that's actually my need? Two, am I right about how I'm servicing that need? Do people actually want to solve that problem, and do they want to solve it the way I want to solve it? Sometimes people don't actually want to solve the problem. Maybe they don't want to know. Maybe they don't want the information surfaced. Instead, they just want you to fix it. They want you to surface the information. They want you to find the information and fix it, or issue an alert, or take some action, or whatever. Our bet is that they want to know rather than for you to assume and do, but maybe I'm wrong. Next example is knowing what's possible. So this is another way of looking at what you're building. So let's assume there is a need of some kind that people need to keep track of their personal contacts, right? So I've always wanted something like this, something I would call a personal relationship management system, something like a CRM, but for your own contact list. So the way to read this is that vertically, what you have is separate products or capabilities, and horizontally, they all add up to this thing. But there's, you have a limited number of resources, you have a limited number of engineers. There's only so much you can build at once. So you have to get to a point in building each major capability that it is in and of itself viable and valuable. So is it usable? Will someone pay for it? Is it sufficient to generate funds or revenue to then build the next thing, and so on and so forth? So, is that actually the case? Is a PRM the right way to solve the problem? If it's not the right way to solve the problem, is there a better way to solve the problem? Can I get from where I am to where that is? Let's go back for a second. So imagine this. Imagine we're 3 steps down on the second column, which in this case would mean I am able to build a graph out of your contacts based on your communications over email and social networking, and based on some kind of behavior pattern and understanding the degrees of separation between you and other things. I cannot go from there to all the way on the right where I auto-suggest things that you should do or communications that you should have. But I can go from there to the next thing over. What if I find out that people don't actually want anything to the right or anything below of where I am? Now you have some options. You can scrap the whole thing or start over, which is very expensive. It means going under. Or you can scrap everything from the point where you are forward and build something new. But there are limitations there because everything you build closes doors and limits the next thing that you can build. So, if I build columns 1 and 2, I can't then go build a restaurant reservation system. That's not going to happen. But I could conceivably build a referral network. That can happen, because now I have a contact graph, and you can get from a contact graph to a referral network. Now, this is what I think of as the most interesting and hard thing, which is being able to figure out what the right mix of people is that you need. So in my view, being anti-fragile in an organizational capacity means being able to deal with many different kinds of challenges and stress and react in such a way that you grow from them. In my experience, the only way to do that is to have a diversity of approaches, views, and opinions in the organization. So what happens is, especially because my own makeup is that I've been in tech for a very long time. I'm very deep and very broad in tech, and pretty much not in anything else. That means I have very specific patterns of responses and behaviors when I'm challenged in any kind of way, in business, personally, or whatever. Which means I also break in very specific ways. And most of the people that I work with break in those same exact ways because we're all tech people. So the only way I found to get around that is to hire people who don't look like me, don't have the same background as I do, and are wildly different in approach and thinking. So what happens is when they have a business problem like, this customer bought the product, but refuses to be a reference or say anything nice about us, and is generally cranky in public. But they keep paying us, and they seem to like us by their actions, but not by their words. I generally don't know how to solve that problem. But I have folks on my team who have degrees in art and lit and drama and business and other things. And they figure out approaches to talk to individuals that I don't know and that I don't have, which get them to be nicer or to say good things. So in my view, what I've discovered over the years is that diversity is basically an intrinsic and inherent good. It prevents you from getting stuck in a particular pattern of behavior or a particular approach or a particular pattern of response to stressors and challenges. It's basically literally stirring the pot. For those of you who have backgrounds in physics or chemistry, you'll get into a local maximum position, and the only way to get out of it is to stick your hands in things and churn them around a bit in order to find a better solution. And you can't do that with all the same people who think all the same way and behave all the same way. And a lot of times, it's not just the case that the people have to be different, but they have to be able to be different. So like, you can invalidate your team. You can invalidate the model of your team structure by seeing what happens when you issue it with challenges. Is it that the team is the wrong team? Or is it that I have failed to make it safe for the team to be itself, for the people to be different? Have I provided people challenges that actually are interesting? Have I enabled them to grow? Have I created an environment where they feel comfortable expressing all their views or opinions? I've found more often than not that I am the problem on my team, not that the team is poorly constructed or that it's the wrong team. It's just that I haven't done the things necessary to enable them to succeed and to respond to challenges well. Oh, cool, I did that super fast. That happens every year. So again, operating principles, one is always be refactoring. So the world is always changing, and technical debt is going to pile up, and it's going to pile up in your code, it's going to pile up on your team, it's going to pile up in your business, it's going to pile up in your marketing organization, it's going to pile up in sales. And if you're not constantly messing with things and changing and refactoring and finding better ways to do things, it's eventually going to bite you. Diversity has intrinsic value. I don't know how to stress it any more than I do. I don't have a proof for it other than all the research on the importance of having diverse people and teams, but I have found over and over again in 20 years in this business that there is nothing better. I don't need people to be super technical. Honestly, I can do that. There are plenty of people who can be super technical. What I do need is for people to bring different opinions to the table, and I need to do whatever necessary to make that possible. Third is that the territory is more important than the map. So whatever model you have of the business, of the landscape, of the way a function is supposed to work, all the assumptions, you have to go find where they're wrong. And you have to find the things that make them wrong. And you have to put a lot of effort into that, more effort than you do into just making things work, because eventually something's going to break. And it's better if you find it before it finds you. And finally, seek invalidation. Try to invalidate everything all the time. Always look for the little things that suggest you might be wrong, and instead of explaining them away, take them seriously. Take them more seriously than the things that suggest you're right. It's as good in building things in engineering as it is in business. Here's some reading. I like books more than I like papers, so I recommend books. I'll point out one thing that is interesting here. So the reason I suggest this particular book is because it suggests a different way of looking at things. So it takes a city, and instead of looking at the normal affordances of architecture, which is that door is there so I can open it, a burglar's view is that door is there, which means I must go around it because that's a normal way people get in and out of things. If you're even remotely into security, you'll find that fascinating. And that's it. Thank you very much. Wait. Oh, wow. I have time. If anybody has a question, feel free to ask. I apologize for the scattered nature of the talk.
Hey.
Hey.
I like physics. What were you trying to say about the local maxima?
So if you basically, at least in chemistry, if you can have a local maximum, which is a liquid, that's in a particular state, and it stays in that state under extreme stress unless you mix it up. And if you mix it up, it will find a new local maximum, which is resilient to a higher level of stress. Basically that. Yeah?
How do you approach assessing the quality of hires who think very differently from you?
Oh, that's a good question. So quality has multiple dimensions. So in my specific case, I am in a marketing function and run a marketing function. So there is the quality of being able to perform the function, right? That's the essential baseline. So assuming ability to perform the function, I, at that point, stop looking functionally. And I am trying to figure out whether or not, given a certain challenge, if you're going to have a different take on it than I am. So I don't look for someone who has my approach. I don't look for someone who confirms what I think is the best way to do a thing. I specifically look for people who do not have my approach and have a different way of doing a thing that I did not think of. Even if that's not necessarily what I think is the best way, it's kind of irrelevant whether or not I think it's the best way. The fact that they can functionally do the work and yet have a different view or approach or way of thinking about a thing is important to me. Yeah.
So you had said on your slide hiring for anti-fragility.
Yes.
So I might think that, let's see, I think I might be able to construct an organization, a set of processes, maybe even the tools that could tend more towards brittleness than having adaptive capacity, right? If that's the case, then to what extent is anti-fragile an individual attribution? So I can hire for height, I can hire for weight,
Yeah.
I could hire for all kinds of individual attribution. But I'm not convinced that anti-fragility is an individual attribution.
So neither am I.
Okay.
So I would state that it is not possible to make any individual component or person and think of them as being anti-fragile. But it is possible to take a system or a group of people or a team or organization and have it be anti-fragile to some set of constraints by virtue of being able to handle very many different things and being able to respond in a way that increases ability to handle many different things, which I think cannot happen if you've got homogeneity of any kind. It can only happen if you have heterogeneity, which makes the organization harder to run and to manage and to deal with and to get moving in a particular direction, but in times of stress makes it very resilient. Okay. Anybody else? I appreciate everyone's tolerance today. Cheers.